I expected this to be hard, but I didn't expect to be this hard.
That's right, stage 5 of Zwift World Series is here and it is not a usual race. In fact, it is probably the hardest race I've ever done so far. 47 kilometers, 1500 vertical meters and 4 categorized climbs. Its name is Powered to the Tower. It will bring you twice to Epic KOM, once from the front and once from behind. In between those you will also have to do the grade, and at the end there is the scary steep ascent towards the radio tower. This is about as far from my ideal race as it gets. Super hilly, racing at the very bottom of a category. This was 520 to 690 category, so it was really not the matter of finishing well, but rather finishing, period. I fully expected to be dropped at the very first incline, which we are approaching right now, so my goal was to beat at least someone. And you can do this in one of the two ways: either you are better than someone, or you beat people because you finished the race and they don't. Here we arrived at the bottom of the first climb of the day. This is the start of Epic KOM Reverse, and since it was very early in the race, I was afraid that the group might go all out, disregarding the length of the race and overall difficulty of this course. The group started climbing at around 5 watts per kilo, which is a power that I can climb for about 4 to 5 minutes, but definitely not for 1500 vertical meters. But I thought it might be because it was still very early in the race and the guys felt fresh, and I was hoping that the pace would settle down really quickly. So even when I knew I wasn't able to maintain this pace for a very long time, I decided to stick with it, at least for now. This is the first steep part of the Epic KOM Reverse, and I thought if the pace was to slow down, it would happen on the bridge that is coming very soon. You can see that on the diagram, pictured in yellow. And even if it didn't, I at least hoped that the group would split into two, which would mean that I still have people to climb with. But unfortunately there was only 23 people in this race. I guess those really hard Zwift World Series races aren't that popular as other races that are currently online, especially since there is the Tour de Zwift going on right now. So I knew that if I was to be dropped, I would need to ride this course basically by myself for the remaining duration. At this point it started to look like the group is going to leave me, so I put an extra power to catch up with them, and I really hoped that the effort would calm down at this flatter portion right above this crest of this hill. But as you'll see in a short while, that didn't actually happen. The effort remained the same, and I knew at this point that if I continued with this group, I would really blow myself up and was unable to continue. Especially since there was all 3 of the big climbs still ahead of us. At this point I was still doing over 4 watts per kilo, but the group was steadily leaving me, and I knew that my time with the company in this race was slowly but surely coming to an end. So I slowed down a little bit and shifted my focus from staying with the group to finishing the race. But it was still very early in the race. There was still 40 kilometers of distance remaining and most of the climbing remaining actually. So I really needed to think hard about what the purpose and what the goals in this race are going to be for me. I knew right from the start that this race would take about 2 hours, so I needed to ride pretty well below my FTP. But since it was a race, I didn't want to just zone to it. So I decided I would convert this race to a pretty good tempo workout. So if we take an inventory of what's happening right now, you can see I'm at 20th place out of 23 riders. So at this point I set myself about 3 interim goals and 1 bonus goal. The first one was to not get caught by the guy behind me. I saw they were about 20 seconds behind me and were doing about the same power as I was. So I thought that would be a good driver to not slow down during the climbs and force myself going. My second goal was to finish and thus beat everyone who doesn't, who quits. And I expect there would be people who would say that it is not really beating those guys, but honestly, if you want to win, you need to finish first. So Not quitting when it gets hard is actually a pretty big component of that. Thirdly, I wanted to get a really good training stimulus out of this race, so I told myself I would hold about 3 watts per kilo on the climbs and recover on the descents. 3 watts per kilo is about my sweet spot zone, so by doing 3 really long intervals at this zone and recovering on the descents should give me a great training boost. And of course there was the bonus goal of catching someone in front of me. It is important to say that that wasn't entirely in my hands, because in order for me to catch them, they would need to have crisis on their own. And those guys were actually really good, because we are already about 15 minutes in this climb and they are still doing about 4, even 5 watts per kilo. I'm really eager to see the elite version of this race. Obviously for now the Zwift World Series, the elite races are postponed because there are the issues with the trainers, but hopefully those issues will get sorted out really soon. Because honestly, watching the pros do this would be really fun, and I would be really eager to see what numbers can they do. So the first climb of the day, the Epic KOM reverse, is done, and I really focused on recovering during the descent, so whenever it was possible I was trying to super tuck and not pedal whatsoever. Obviously the descent from the Epic KOM reverse isn't only descending, so you need to do some efforts even when you are descending. But in addition to the super tuck, I try to utilize my Zwift play as well as possible, because since I didn't have the group to ride with, I wanted to make the race as efficient as possible, at least with the tools that I had. So you can see that right now on the great descent that I'm always trying to cut the inside of the corners. You can see that the guy behind me that I was trying to stay away from was about 2 minutes and 40 seconds behind me, so that gave me a confidence boost before the start of the second climb of the day. I also saw that the guy in front of me had a little crisis on their own, and I was only about 25 seconds behind them at this point, so I thought I might catch them if they are having a bad moment, but I wasn't going to do anything reckless. I simply focused on keeping my 3 watts per kilo steady, and here you can see that the guy caught a second wind and was doing 4 watts per kilo, leaving me pretty quickly. By the way, if you are wondering why I had such trouble to keep up with this race, it's for 3 reasons actually. Firstly, the guys in this category 520 to 690 are head and shoulders above me. There's absolutely no denying that. Before this race I had the rating of 527, which put me directly at the bottom of this category, and I actually think that's fine, because at any time there has to be someone at the bottom of each category, right? But it still meant that I was racing in the company of way better riders, and you can actually still see in the bar on the right that those guys are doing 4 watts per kilo steadily after 48 minutes of the race. Now if this was a flat race, I might have had higher chances to stay with them, because number 2, I can do a pretty good raw watts. But since I weigh 76 kilo, it does not transfer to good watts per kilo. I actually recently started to work on my weight loss, and if I was able to lose about 10 kilos while retaining my raw power, my performance, especially on climb, would skyrocket. So that's something I've been working on lately, and we'll see if that's something I will be able to achieve. But I think if I want to improve and if I want to reach the A category or whatever it is called right now, I simply need to lose weight, because I'm training pretty diligently, but there's only as far as you can get just with training. At this point, losing the extra kilos is going to be the fastest way forward. So here I'm finishing the second climb of the day, the Great, and you can actually see that the power up I received at the Epic KOM was the draft, and it was actually the only option you can get in this race. And on one hand it is a good thing, because there is reduced variance and the luck factor is reduced, but on the other hand it meant that I basically didn't have any power up in this race, because obviously as I was riding alone, draft power up was pretty useless for me. This part of this course is pretty disheartening, because You've just finished riding up the grade and you are riding this emotional roller coaster, and there are still more climbing towards the epic KOM. But at this point I increased my gap to my chaser to over 4 minutes, and if you look at the standings you can see that I moved up 2 places because 2 people in front of me quit. And that is the risk of going too hot from the start. You can stay with the group longer, which probably I was able to stay with the group a little longer, but if it causes you to hit the wall later in the race and ultimately forces you to quit, it isn't worth it. So I've just finished the second climb of the day, the great climb with the epic KOM forward finish, and at this point I was pretty sure I would be able to keep my gap to my chaser, but on the other hand the guy I was within reach from at the start of the great climb got actually 7 minutes gap to me. So right now I'm doing the super tuck down the epic KOM reverse, and I actually find an extra strength that could help me. As I said earlier, this race didn't bode with me well for 3 reasons. I've already spoken about 2, and the third one is I actually forgot to open my windows, so my cooling was super bad. I was stupidly overheating, and the remedy came at this point when my wife entered the room and opened the window for me. So at this point I suddenly felt a lot better. Obviously it wouldn't help me to compete in this race because the guys in front of me were simply just too good, but it is a mistake that I shouldn't really make, especially when I'm doing a difficult race like this. When this happens during Z racing, well, it's not good either, but the race is over in 25, 30, 35 minutes. But if the race takes 2 hours, I should be really careful with this. Here I started the last climb of the day, the epic KOM forward with the radio tower finished, and you can see that another rider in front of me quit. And that was actually a pretty nice takeaway point for me from this race. Sometimes in sports it's not about being better, sometimes it's about being more persistent and simply not giving up and not quitting. What was actually good about this race was my approach to nutrition. I took an energy gel before each of the major climbs, and in between I was drinking the sports drink. I had 3 bottles of sports drink and it was about enough. And at no particular point during the race I was feeling like hitting the wall or feeling really bad from the lack of the nutrition at least. The suspension bridge was now completed and I hit the steeper parts of the epic KOM forward, and I was still focusing on my silent race with the guy behind me. I was steadily increased my lead to him, and that was giving me a mental boost. And what's more, I started decreasing the gap to the guys in front of me. It was very unlikely that I would actually catch them, but it was still nice to see that I am able to finish a race this hard pretty strong. But only when you are doing a race this difficult, you can appreciate how much of a difference the draft actually does. It is actually the difference between being dropped and actually being able to stay with the group for a long time. 7.4 Ks to go, and here I lost my chaser. I don't know if it was the start of the epic KOM that was the last straw for them, but it was nice to have someone basically pushing me in the back, at least virtually. At this point, it was just me. I kept repeating to myself that this was a really good workout. I didn't want to fall back to zone 2 for the rest of this race, but I would be lying if I said that it wasn't really tempting. By this point, the winner of this race was already done, so that shows the difference between them and myself. The winner of this race managed to hold 4.2 watts per kilo for the whole duration of this race, which for them was actually 1 hour and 30 minutes. And that's with all the descents on which they presumably weren't doing any high watts or any watts for that matter. So that really shows the competition I was facing in this race. At this point I think it's pretty clear I wasn't going to catch anyone in front of me, so my final position only depended on whether or not someone in front of me would drop still from the race, And since the finish line was pretty close by now, I didn't think it was very likely by this point. I still wanted to make the 2-hour mark in this race, but that was about as much as I could strive for today. So right here I'm finishing the climb up the Epic KOM in order to get to the final and the hardest challenge of the day, the radio tower climb, which isn't very long but it's extremely steep, and tucked at the end of race this hard, it was really brutal challenge. Don't quote me on that, but I actually believe this was the very first time radio tower climb was used as a race finish. So here I am finishing the Epic KOM and entering the radio tower climb, and at this point it is clear that my current position is going to be actually my final one. So I will finish this race on 16th place out of 23 riders. Not because I was better than the 7 riders behind me, but because I was more persistent and didn't quit. Being the best in the group you are racing in is something that you cannot often influence, but you can always influence this. So to answer the question, is this race too hard for your average Zwifter? Well, it depends. If you are racing at the top of your category or you are an accomplished climber, it's probably not too hard. It is still an extremely hard race, but you will be able to compete. But if you are someone who is like me at the bottom of a category and climbing isn't really your strong suit, there is probably not much you can do to be successful in a race like this. Thank you guys for watching, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.